Okay, let's get started. Before I begin, I want to just sort of make you aware of some resources if you're interested in sort of further reading, further study on this topic. First is an issue of an online journal called Me'orot, which you can find if you Google Me'orot. The Shvat 5767 edition has several articles about war and Jewish tradition by some quite interesting scholars. It's free and you can get it online. I guess one of you can get one of the articles just right now by taking it from me when you leave. So I'll put that right here. But it's free and has some excellent articles. The other resource is this book that's published by the Orthodox Forum, War and Peace in the Jewish Tradition. Also has a number of really excellent books. This book as well is also available free online. If you go to this, most of the books that are published in the Orthodox Forum series, if you go to yutorah.org, you can find most of these books in the series in PDF version. So quite a few of the articles in this book are really well worth your time. Another resource is not, unfortunately, online entirely, though bits of it are available in various places here and there. This is Tchumin. Tchumin is a journal that's published by Mechon Somet. Somet are the people who they do the metal detectors at the Kotel. So it's sort of like the Institute of Science and Halacha. But in addition, that's what they're called, the Science and Torah. Yeah. So they do that kind of thing. They also do halacha and modern society kind of issues as well. They publish a journal, volume 4 from the 80s, has a lot of really relevant material. They still come out with a journal every year, and it's interesting and valuable. And so has this volume 4 in particular, volume 5 as well. I have a lot of really foundational essays on issues of warfare. So that's lots of places for further research. Let's start with the source 3, okay? And this is the sort of framework that Rambam and Maimonides presents for warfare, and he writes this in the very end of his Mishnah Torah, the Laws of Kings. It's actually the full name of this section is Laws of Kings and Their Wars. Okay, so warfare is sort of linked with the power of the state that he's defining and delineating in this section of Mishnah Torah. So he writes, Ein hamelech nilcham tchila ela milchemet mitzvah. King should not go out to fight other than, or first a king must fight a milchemet mitzvah, an obligatory war. The ezehi milchemet mitzvah. What is an obligatory war? Zo milchemet shiva amimim, milchemet amalek, ve'ezrat Yisrael miyad sar sheba alehem. So the 3 types of obligatory war that a king has to wage. The war of conquest of the land of Israel against the 7 Canaanite nations. 2, the war against the tribe of Amalek. And 3 is a war to come in defense of Israel from an enemy that Sheba Alehem, that is coming against them. V'char kach nilcham b'milchemet harishut v'yamilchama shnilcham im shar ha'amim kedei laharchiv gehul Yisrael u'laharbot b'gzulato v'shamo. And then after that, after he's completed those obligatory wars, then if the king wants to, he can go and engage in sort of conventional warfare for the purpose of aggrandizing his nation and increasing its borders, etc. Then he writes, "Milchemet mitzvah eino tzarich litol barishut Beit el yotzei mi'atzmo b'chol eitz." Obligatory mitzvah, the king can muster his army and go out to fight one without the need to seek prior approval from a court. And he can force the nation, he can raise an army, he can conscript soldiers to go with him. But he can't fight an obligatory, optional war without prior approval from a Sanhedrin of 71 judges. Okay? So in the absence of a Sanhedrin, this whole category of optional warfare is taken off the table, and that's sort of no longer a category that can be applied. Not only that, another category that's taken off the table is the category of the war against the 7 nations and the war against Amalek. Why is that taken off the table? They don't exist anymore. That's source 2. Okay, the Mishnah says very clearly there was an Ammonite who wanted to convert. The Torah says Ammonites are not allowed to convert, and that was a dispute between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua. And in the end, Yeshua said, "Look, the Ammonites and the Moabites, they don't exist anymore. Are they still living in their land? No, because Sennacherib came and mixed everyone up." And all the nations are mixed up, and anyone can become a convert and marry Jews, because none of these sort of ethnic identities that are mentioned in the Torah, none of them exist except for Jews. We're the only ones who survived the Assyrian Empire's efforts at promoting assimilation. Okay, and we survived, no one else did, and so none of these statuses exist anymore. So you can't. So there's no more war against the 7 nations. And nor Amalek. Also worth noting that, let's just see, look at source 5, jump ahead. Even when it comes to these, we saw last time sort of the very extreme, sort of genocidal warfare that the Torah calls for against, or seems to call for against the Canaanite nations and against Amalek. Rambam writes explicitly in source 5 here, Ein osim milchama im adam ba'olam ad shekarin lo l'shalom echad milchemet harishut ve'echad milchemet mitzvah shneimar ki tikrav al ir lilachem alea v'karata le l'shalom. Rambam is explicit. There is no category of warfare which is not preceded by a call for peace. It's included in that would be the milchemet mitzvah, the obligatory war, even in this sort of early biblical paradigm that Rambam is presenting and including in his law code of going to the wars of conquest against the Canaanite nations, etc. That's still preceded by a call for peace. Rambam's basis is really in the Torah itself. You look at source 1. I'm sorry we're jumping around the order of the source sheet and the order of my presentation do not coincide always. God said to Moshe, I told you to make war against Sichon, but you offered him peace by your life. I will fulfill your ordinance. Whenever you go to war, they must begin by offering peace. Okay? God in... right, Moshe sends messengers of peace to Sichon before attacking Sichon. God had told Moshe, go and smite Sichon, and Moshe sends an emissaries of peace. And God, and in the Midrash, God responds to Moshe saying, "Oh, that's how you want to do things? Fine. You want to send emissaries of peace? That's going to be the law. The law is you have to send emissaries of peace before you attack." And so that's sort of like this interesting dynamic that the Torah describes. The Midrash reads into the Torah, where God commands war, Moshe makes an offer of peace, and God endorses that decision of Moshe, and becomes part of like sort of the law moving forward, that you always proclaim an offer of peace. So what does that leave us with? That leaves us with what category of warfare is left? Yes. So Rabbi explains it's sort of the terms by which they have to abandon idolatry, they have to sort of abide by sort of basic moral codes. They have to agree to our sovereignty in the land of Israel. There's sort of their conditions. But they're terms given. Furthermore, you always leave like an opening. People want to run away, can run away. That's all sort of there as well. So what are we left with? We're left with There's no optional war now because we have we don't have a Sanhedrin. And there's no obligatory war against the Canaanites and against Amalek because they don't exist anymore. So we're left with a war of coming to defense of Israel against an enemy that comes against them. And also worth pointing out, the Chazon Ish, in his comment to source 6, I apologize, the Hebrew was really, it did not survive the photocopying particularly well, but somewhere in there it says, the point I want to show you is that, sort of points out that for Rambam, this obligatory war of coming to the defense against an enemy that's attacking, that's only an enemy that's attacking. An enemy which isn't attacking, that's not grounds for war. Even if they're Canaanites, right? Even if they were somehow identified, even if at a time before Sennacherib, when you had these 7 Canaanite nations, you can't attack them. It's only if they attack you first, okay? And that's how the Chazon Ish understands Rambam. So, what's not an excuse for war? Oh, let's think of reasons for warfare, and we can sort of, based on what we know now, what falls into it, what doesn't fall into it. Yes?
To increase your territory.
Increase your territory, not a grounds for war. Agreed. Right. What else?
And to take the other nation's property or to enslave the people.
Correct. Not legitimate grounds for war. What else is or is not grounds for war, based on what we've seen so far?
Suspicion that they may
Okay. Explain why you say that. What are you sort of? I've actually so that's right. So if it's the enemy's coming to get you, like you have to wait for them to like make the first step, and what counts as the first step? That's a good question. I don't really know. I would say we haven't seen quite enough to know what we call peremptory war. Whatever.
Yes,
That's a good question. Yeah. So I don't know how short do you have to be, right? And what counts as the first step? That's a good question. We don't know the answer to that, but that is a good question. What about a war of national liberation? Is that allowed?
To establish a state?
Yeah, is that permissible?
Well, it's not. All these sources pre-assume a state of Israel.
These are laws for the king who somehow established he has a kingdom. So how does he have a kingdom if there hasn't been a war to kind of establish his kingdom? Okay, so Joshua led people they conquered the land of Israel and he had a little kingdom there. So, Moshe had a little army marching through the desert. But that was the initial sort of battle of conquest. It's unclear. The Talmud tells us that when the Jewish people went into exile, God made us take 3 oaths. One was not to force our way back into Eretz Yisrael. The other was not to rebel against the nations. And the third oath was that the nations shouldn't oppress us too much. So this Gemara has a very interesting history. It was sort of wasn't really discussed in a great interest or intensity until modern times, where obviously it becomes much more fraught. I don't think it's obvious that a war for national liberation would be permissible. And I think it's not at all obvious that would be a permissible reason to fight a war. This is explicitly the topic of source 4. This is Rav Herzog. Rav Herzog we discussed in a great length, quoted him in great length last week. He is the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. He was from Lumsha in Lithuania. He was chief rabbi of in Dublin or Ireland, I guess. He took part in that famous three-way. I think it was him. Yeah, that three-way rabbinic contest, the most famous rabbinic search processes in history. Who would be the rabbi of Tel Aviv in the 1930s? The 3 candidates were Rav Joseph Soloveitchik, Rav Herzog, and Rav Amiel. And Rav Amiel won. He was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. Rav Soloveitchik ended up in Boston and never returned to the land of Israel again in his life after that, visited as a young man. And Rav Herzog went back to Ireland, but became the chief rabbi of all of Israel after, a few years later, when, I guess it was in the 20s, right? Because he became chief rabbi when Rav Kook died in 1935. So a short time later, he came back. He sort of lost the battle but won the war, or something like that. Anyway, so he's writing here about, in the context of Israel's war for independence, and Zot, I have to mention, She'ani dibarti rak b'nikudat hashkafa shel pikuach nefesh. Up until now, I've been discussing this topic from the perspective of pikuach nefesh, of sort of saving lives. Right? There's an obligation to save. We're allowed or obligated to save our own lives. We can intervene to save lives of others. And in certain contexts, a war could be considered just like the interpersonal ethics of pikuach nefesh on a grand scale. So for success, up until now, I've been dealing with understanding what's going on, this phenomenon, through the perspective, the prism of pikuach nefesh. But I think, however, that this war that we're fighting, this struggle actually, has the status of Milchemet Mitzvah. So he has to prove it. It's not obvious, but Herzog has to prove why a war of national liberation could be considered Milchemet Mitzvah. Mechar she'ha'um natnu lanu chelek me'eretz Yisrael v'im lo nit gonen kira'ui nafsid chalila hizdamnut zo v'gam lo yelanu od miklat muchan lachinu shebegola v'mikresh shel tzara v'chman l'tzlan v'day lanu nisyon ha'acharon v'gam im nafsid hizdamnut zo ze yavi chas v'shalom hamonei Yisrael lidei yeyush v'yigram chas v'shalom behemshech hazman v'toldat k'shenu v'rov ha'umah v'tzmiyah v'hitbolulut v'day chacham shechemoto. So the United Nations has given us permission to establish a state. And if we don't seize this opportunity, they're not going to give it to us again. And there's no other place for our brethren to find refuge. Our recent tribulations were so great that if we were to fail in this endeavor, the result to the multitudes of Jews around the world who are hopeless and despairing, their hopelessness and their despair would increase, and they would abandon their connection to Judaism. It would be the end of Judaism if we're not successful. Milchemet mitzvah, halot tzarim, lechatchila b'shabbat, al ayrot shel goyim. So certainly, the topic at hand, if it's in the Milchemet mitzvah, we're allowed to engage in military operations on Shabbat. Certainly, defensive operations we can do on Shabbat, which was the sort of the technical topic that he was addressing in this tshuva. So, according to Herzog, a war of national liberation can be considered a Milchemet mitzvah, but not because it's legitimate per se to seize one's independence and fight to achieve it, but because the United Nations has authorized it, which I think we saw last week was really crucial for how Howard Herzog kind of understands the state of Israel as being like this, really, granted by, sort of affirmed by international law, granted by the United Nations. That was really crucial to a lot of his halachic understanding of the state of Israel. And if we were to fail, it would be like this disaster for the Jewish people. And so the war is like defending the Jewish people from the disaster. But the disaster isn't only the destruction of the Jewish communities in the land of Israel. The disaster is like the mass despair of Jews all over the world who have no place to find refuge and who will, in their despair, will sort of intermarry and stop affiliating as Jews. Yeah, Shalom.
What's the distinction? It doesn't sound like a people of message. It sounds more like usually the problem with assimilation is most of people where there is no despair, where Jews are treated equal in society and don't feel any stick together.
Good. So you're usually making two different points. The first point, you're right, this is not Pikuach Nefesh. I think the prior paragraph was about Pikuach Nefesh, and that was the discussion was, for the sake of, self-defense and Pikuach Nefesh, can we, do our whatever defensive operations on Shabbat? Can we have our guns and do our patrols, etc., and our jeeps on Shabbat? And that's what he dealt with. But for now, that's an interesting question because Pikuach Nefesh usually requires, like Pikuach Nefesh l'fanenu, it has to be in front of us. You're not allowed to carry a life preserver on Shabbat as you stroll on the lake in case you see somebody drowning. So you wouldn't necessarily be allowed to drive your Jeep on patrol in case there's some but in a case of war where the danger is greater, maybe you could. And that's so from the standpoint of Pikuach Nefesh, that was the earlier part. Now he's saying forget about Pikuach Nefesh, or not forget about Pikuach Nefesh, but in addition to the Pikuach Nefesh, there's also Milchemet Mitzvah. This is a obligatory war which is a framework that exists in the Torah. And from the Milchemet Mitzvah, we're allowed to even engage in offensive actions on Shabbat, and certainly we can engage in defensive actions on Shabbat for war of Milchemet Mitzvah. Second, it's sort of interesting, what causes assimilation is, the one, yes, it is when Jews are embraced, so that is a force for assimilation. I think also, the thinking is that, Jewish pride can be a bulwark against assimilation. And if there is this, reborn state of Israel that we can all be proud of, that is a that can fuel Jewish identity. And I think that is the case. I think, to the extent that people are proud of Israel and feel good about Israel, I think that does strengthen their Jewish identity. And I think the reverse is also true as well. Yeah.
So it seems like he's saying that this opportunity for the land, the state of Israel, is actually being pushed towards us a little bit. And it's only because the United Nations is actually pushing it towards us that we are obligated to, one, act on it, and also therefore execute warfare in order to achieve it. But if it was not pushed towards us by the United Nations, if it was just there as an option, then it wouldn't be permissible.
He doesn't say pushed. He says, Natnu lanu chelik mi'eretz Yisrael. The United Nations have given us a portion of Eretz Yisrael. For us to establish a state, we have to seize this opportunity. It's not that they're imposing this, like they want to give us a state and we don't want it, but he's saying...
We're the ones acting to seize the opportunity, so it seems like we're precipitating this war.
So he doesn't see us precipitating the... Look, there didn't have to be a war, right? What I heard the vote to accept... it's interesting, the vote to accept the UN partition plan was 6-5 in favor, meaning among the Jews, meaning not the vote of the UN. The vote among the Jews was 6-5 in favor of accepting the partition plan. I don't know if the Arabs had a vote, but they did not accept the partition plan. Had they accepted the partition plan too, there would not have been a war. And we would have had a much smaller state, and I think Rav Herzog would have said, we would have no right to wage war for Jerusalem or for the parts of the Galil that were supposed to be part of the Palestinians. Right? I don't think he would have, right? But given that the war existed, so now we're in a situation where we have to fight to secure that which the United Nations granted us. And had the United Nations voted against the partition plan, Rav Herzog might have said it's forbidden to wage war. I'll say, if you read, if you've read Michael Oren's History of the Six-Day War, which I recommend, one of the really sort of interesting things among the interesting things in that book is that I think there was one religious cabinet member in the Israeli government at the time of the war. I think he was, Rabbi Warhaftig. I think Zerach Warhaftig was his name, and he was, I think, Minister of Religious Affairs or something like that. But he was in the cabinet, so he got to vote. And every step of the unfolding of the war, he voted against escalation and against expanding the war to additional fronts. He was against the decision to conquer Jerusalem, and et cetera, right? So it's sort of interesting. I don't think not necessarily for halachic reasons, but for certain like his worldview was much less militaristic than the other people with whom he was sitting in the cabinet. And that's also interesting. That was. I don't think he was alone. I think in that generation, you had a real sense amongst the many of the sort of leaders of secular Israel that Judaism was a force for passivity and weakness, and there was a real part of the anti-tradition spirit in some early secular Zionism was because they understood Judaism to be a force for passivity and sort of against the need for fighting. So it's maybe a little okay. Who's talking about that? He's talking about the Israeli War of Independence, so I don't know what you would call that, meaning there was a Jewish community that lived in, Jews owned 10% of the land of Israel, right, in 1947 or 1948, and the UN partition plan gave us, 50% of the land, and then the war was fought, et cetera, right, so... Yeah, so he says the state itself is a shutfut, it's a partnership, correct. How do you reconcile that with... Yeah, so the Jewish people wage a war after the United Nations gave us this. The United Nations gave us a permission to establish a democratic state that would give equal citizen rights to people regardless of religion, ethnicity, and sex. and we accepted that and waged a war to secure that which was granted by the United Nations. And then we set up a state, a democratic state, is a shutfut, it's a partnership between all its citizens. And since we were the majority, it's called by our name, and maybe that's what he would say. You don't have to reconcile this tshuva with that essay, because they're doing two different things. This tshuva is, is it permissible to drive a Jeep on Shabbos in the context of a war, and he's saying this is a mechemet mitzvah. That essay is, how do we understand democracy and minority rights in the context of a Jewish state? How can a Jewish state grant democratic rights to a minority? And he says, well, a democratic state isn't actually a Jewish state. A democratic state is a shutfut, and that's why it's really, we can allow, like Christian worship in a Jewish state, etc. Okay? You don't like it?
It's not consistent.
Okay, that's okay, right? So he's answering he has two different problems. It doesn't have to be consistent. I think it's possible to reconcile, but he doesn't. It also, I don't think it's two different essays. Don't have to be. He's replied to two different questions, so he can do that in different ways, I think. Any other limits to declaring war? Right. Again, separate from the way in which you declare war, what they call the military conduct, military ethics, just like declaring a war in general. So we see an interesting source here. Source 7. The Gemara in Shavuot says, "Malchuta dekat lechad mishita v'yamalo miyansha." Okay, a government that kills up to 1/6 is not punished. Okay, more than 1/6 though, then you'll be punished. So what does this mean? So Tosfot say behotzaat the milchemet harishut kam. This is talking about an optional war, and so it's saying you're going off for an optional war. Tosfot says so you shouldn't do it if your casualties are going to be more than 1/6 of your nation is going to be killed. You can't go off and fight an optional war. That's how Tosfot understand this passage. Maharsha. It's a little different. The Maharsha quotes Tosfot, verse 9, and says, "Lo mashmalu be'ingaria perish Rashi ella dekat lemamash, lo mashmalu de memalchei Yisrael ayri kra, v'otzal lemilchemet harishut u'lemilchemet mitzvah kativ lo tichiyah kol neshama." Right, this is a statement being made about a Jewish government, and when it says killing, that means real killing, not your draft. Can you draft a 1/6 of the nation? Which is how Rashi understands this, and that's one Gemara goes in that direction and for a bit. The Maharsha says that in contrast to an obligatory war where the Torah says you kill everyone, for an optional war you can't kill more than 1/6, which means that the 1/6 is referring not to your own population, your own casualties. It's referring to your enemy's casualties. So that's sort of interesting. Here we have as a limit. You can't wage war if more than 1/6 of your enemy's population is going to be killed. And that's a pretty high bar, or a pretty low bar, depending how you want to. It's not that's a massive amount of people being killed. I don't know if we have examples of wars in which more than 1/6 of the population is killed. I would hope not. But it's still sort of interesting that, according to the Maharsha, the Torah introduces this barrier to warfare based on the casualties of your enemy. There's sort of like a humane limit to warfare beyond which we can't go.
How do you know what 1/6 is? What you do this much and then we're okay? How do you know?
Well, it would be sort of interesting in the context of nuclear warfare, where you could really kill everyone, right? And it's sort of what's the line? There's a line. Michael Walzer, who's the great theorist of sort of thinking about just and unjust wars. He has some line about nuclear. He says it's. I'm going to forget what he's. If I find the line, something. I wonder if I can quickly find it. Let me see if I can find it quickly. Hold on. Okay, I think I got it. Second. Okay. Oh, and just wanted to add, Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni, who's a contemporary halachic scholar, has an essay in this book. He says that 1/6 limit also applies to defensive wars. Okay, so that's.
1/6 of the total population of the fight?
I don't know. So here's what I want to say though. Here's the line. The line is. Michael Walzer said, nuclear weapons explode the theory of just war. They are the first of mankind's technological innovations that are simply not encompassable within the familiar moral world. Right? And so sort of the capacity to kill 1/6 of a population, right? That does, that is, yes.
Would it maybe be a matter of gauging how resolved your enemy is, your adversary is? Like if they are so resolved, in their disagreement with you, that they would fight so ferociously that you would have to kill more than 1/6 of them, then you're not really justified in going to war with them because there's nothing discreet about that. I mean, as far as discretion goes, going in and killing them all because you have someone that just
Interesting. Yeah, you're right. Could just be right. Could be your tactics or what you know about the outcome of such a war would be. That would be a limit according to this source. The other piece, though, I saw the threat of something disproportionate is not always a disproportionate threat. Okay, that's also, I think, a clever line. That's Paul Ramsey, right? So that doesn't mean you can sometimes you can threaten something but not do it, and that itself could be okay, right? Even if the thing itself would not be justifiable. Okay, so a few more things to look at. Okay. Look at source 10. Okay, these are, we'll sort of put them into our little edifice we're constructing. Source 10. This is the Netziv. Again, I apologize. The Hebrew is doesn't look quite so as nice as I would like. It's referring to the fact that we punish a murderer. So God explained, when is one penalized for murder? When he ought to have acted with brotherly love, as opposed to wartime, a time of hatred and a time to kill. There is no penalty for that at all. For thus was the world established, as it says in Shavuot, a regime which kills 1/6 is not penalized, and even a king of Israel is permitted to wage a Melchemet Reshut, even though Jews will be killed thereby. So again, he's citing that source. And he's saying there is some sort of amount of killing in the context of war which is permissible. So this, again, it's sort of interesting in that in source 10, this is the Netziv, he's saying there's like a framework of warfare which is, sources are on the table, behind you. Oh. Sorry. There's a framework of warfare in which it's so that war is not like the normal interpersonal rules that govern, murders, pikuach nefesh, writ large. It's sort of like a different paradigm in which certain things become permissible that would otherwise not be. Yeah.
Do you know of any source where the number 1/6 came from?
It's right here. It's in source 7.
Yeah, but
where is it? What the source of that?
Where did they derive it?
We'll look at the Gemara in Shavuot. Okay, look there. So check it out. See there. Okay. It's based on a pasuk. So.
Okay. Isn't it like 1/6 of something to make something that kosher or that?
No, 1/6. It's 1/60th.
Oh, 60.
Yeah. 1/6 is a little more. Yeah, a little more than that. Yeah, it's based on a verse that they're deriving. So in that vein, we look at in a different vein, source 11. This is sort of an interesting source. I never knew. This is the Rokeach, who was a medieval German rabbi, who writes about a story, right? Maaseh shetzaru al ir vermaiza v'chayalot gedolot b'Shabbat v'yitarnu l'chol Yehudim likach kli zainam damrina beperak mishot tziyohu amar Rav Yehuda Marav eino Yehudim shetzaru al ayarot v'ein yotzin aleihen b'chli zainan v'ein mechalin et Shabbat k'shabau al iskei mamon v'al ba'u al iskei nefashot yotzin mechalin aleihem et Shabbat וביר סמוכה לשפר, אפילו לא באו אלא על עסקי תבן, וקש יוצאים אליהם בכלי זין ומחלין השבת, ואתנן כל היוצאים להרוג או להרג, מותר לצאת ולשוב בכלי זין, ועוד אם לא יעזרו היהודים, את העירונים היו הורגים עצמן, hilkach mutar fila b'chli zainan. So it's a case of an enemy was coming to the city, and the rabbi, I guess maybe the Rokeach himself, gave permission to all the Jews of the city to take their weapons and go out and defend the city against this invading army. Based on source in the Gemara that tells very clearly that if an army is attacking and they're going to kill you, then you can go out and fight them on Shabbat. If they're going to come to steal, you have to let them steal your stuff. But if they're going to, my sister-in-law was on a number of research cruises. She's an oceanographer. And some of her cruises, they had to have pirate drills because they were sailing through like dangerous pirate-infested waters. So I thought like pirate drills, you break out the cannons or something, or everyone passes out, muskets or something. But no, a pirate drill, they all go into their bedroom and lie under the bed and close the door. That's the pirate drill, which is pretty. But if they're coming just to steal your stuff, you let them steal your stuff. Unless it's a border town, in which case you have to protect the border, which is interesting, like different rules. Or if they're coming to kill you, then you can fight even on Shabbat. And then he adds, furthermore, even if we don't know the intention of this army outside our city, our own neighbors will kill us if we don't join in self-defense of our city. And so that's also a reason why our lives are at stake if we don't. So this is treating warfare really as different. This is treating warfare as really just pikuach nefesh, right? It's not like a category of war. And as residents of a city, we're permissible to enter into this class of warriors. It's really just like communal pikuach nefesh. It's saving lives applied on a communal level, maybe different than what we saw in source 10. This is another sort of interesting source 12, also interesting source. This is one of the Tshuvot of Moshe Feinstein, 5739. That's 1979. Okay, he wrote this to Rabbi in Kfar Chabad. I believe you're aware that I never write anything. Eini memeher lehashiv, af l'sholi moti l'dvarim shelo nishalti lo shach klal she'ashiv. Right? People who ask me questions, it takes me a long time to respond. And if they don't ask me the question, I certainly don't respond. Okay? There's no reason to. Af she'azeh she'la pratit b'dina yisur v'heter v'chol tshuvotai af l'sholim oti hayurak binyanim pratiim shnegei le'achid shesha'aloti v'davke shlo hayta pigya le'ezerav. I only answer questions. Really amazing statement. This is Moshe Feinstein, one of the greatest poskim halachic scholars. 8 beautiful volumes of Sheilot Tshuvot that will be read 1,000 years from now. And he says, I only respond to questions if it actually concerns somebody who has a real need, who's asking me tell me what to do. I want guidance. And even then, I'm only going to answer the question if it's not going to cause trouble for the local rabbi. Right? If you're going to say, my rabbi did this in the shul, is that okay? He's not going to intervene. Okay? He's not intervening in somebody else's business, somebody else's jurisdiction. But if you have a question what should I do? That's a question he's going to answer. V'she'ela klalit lo hashafti milam. I've never answered a generic question. Lo b'chtav, lo b'peh, not orally, not in writing. V'ulai shamu mimeni ma shemarti l'tamidai. Right, maybe you've heard though what I've said to my students. Maybe you overheard me talking to my students, which I may have said. Ma sheni sover shenyan milchama kevid shenogei lepikuach nefesh tzarich tzivui miyuchad v'orim v'tumim v'sanhedrin af milchemet mitzvah kim milchemet Amalek. Even in milchemet mitzvah, even in obligatory war, since lives are at stake, you can't fight even an obligatory war without the Sanhedrin and the Urim and Tumim. So he thinks even an obligatory war can't be fought now. And Mukhrach zeh mihad David u'Shlomo v'kol melachim atzadikim lo yatzu milachem v'Amalek. There are none of the kings, David and Shlomo, none of them waged war against Amalek. So it must be that even in Melchemet Mitzvah, you have to ask the Sanhedrin, you inquire from the Urim v'Tumim, the special breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, and only if you get approval from those bodies can you fight even in Melchemet Mitzvah. This is obvious to me. Nobody disagrees with this. Not worth arguing about. In all of the Second Temple period, they only waged war in active self-defense, when they were attacked by some non-Jewish force. But there was never a proactive war of conquest or a war of national dependence. It was only an act of direct self-defense. Even in Milchemet Mitzvah, even in what would otherwise be, what we would understand to be an obligatory war, requires the approval of the full Sanhedrin. V'lo danti klum af lo b'machshava eich lachriya ki lo shayach shishalu mimeni ma she'biyadam v'machlu tasholetet be'eretz Yisrael inyanim elu. Right? And I haven't evaluated, not even in my own mind, what should be done by those in leadership position in Eretz Yisrael, meaning the government of Israel. I'm not, because they haven't asked me, and they don't care what I say about it, so I'm not going to offer an opinion. Anu betuchim rak al Hashem yitbarach she'akol hu rak b'yado v'palim elav shirachem aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'yeh hakol l'tova v'gan yishlach lanu b'karav Mashiach tzidkenu. Okay, so I'm not gonna, it's like the opposite. You ask, every Jew has an opinion about what the Israeli government should do. Rosh Feinstein says I'm not even going to think about it because they haven't asked me what to do, and I don't just give Torah opinions. If it's not actually being asked by somebody who wants my opinion, who's going to they're going to make this decision, how to evaluate their tactics, their strategies. It's their decision to make. They haven't asked me. They're not interested in what I have to say, so I'm not going to spend time. I'm not going to tell them, and nor am I going to think about it. He did point out, however, the only type of war that he thinks is permissible is a war of active self-defense. Okay? Yeah.
It seems like a disagreement with the Rambam in source 3, where it says that an obligatory war does not require prior approval by a basic.
Correct. It seems like he does. How would he reconcile that?
Well, I mean, his saving construction would be that all of those obligatory wars are actually wars of self-defense, which I'm not sure I like, but I might be wrong too.
Yeah, I don't know. I think sorry. Melchemet mitzvah einot tzarich litova reshut beitin, and here he says. שעניין מלחמה כיוון שנוגע לפיקוח נפש צריך ציווי מיוחד ורים ותומים בסנהדרין אף במלחמת מצווה. So it seems to be a pretty direct contradiction to Rambam. So okay, he's allowed to have he's allowed that. Rambam, he sort of has a like an outsized is that the right word? Influence, disproportionate influence in these types of issues because he's the only one who wrote about it. He's not the only one who wrote about it, but he wrote, he wrote a code of Jewish law that covers all topics of Jewish law, even things that were not practically applicable in his day, whereas the other great codifiers only wrote about those things that were practiced. So all of these areas which are sort of renewed interest, so you have Rambam who had what to say about it, and the other great didn't have anything to say about it, so he kind of carries it. Yeah?
So when the Rambam is asking about Beit, he's talking about Beitin Shel 71. This is the question in political science. Is he talking about simple majority or a consensus?
A simple majority, I believe.
That's why it's 71.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Although, I think they had to, if I recall, the Sanhedrin of 71, they had to have a 2-vote majority to condemn somebody. I think they had to be, right? And it couldn't be unanimous. If it was unanimous to condemn, the guy got free. So somebody has to be advocating on behalf of this person. So if it was unanimous, he would get off. And I think it had to be a 2-vote majority to condemn somebody. So there was, whatever, but it was not it wasn't consensus, it was a majority. Okay. So here's where I, could have come. To me, the most important source of all is verse 13. This is from Lichtenstein, who we've been sort of mourning this entire month. In 1982, I think he was. Let's see when it was. I don't have the date. This is Tchumin Volume 4, which was published in 1983. So Tafshin Mem Gimel is 1983. So This took place in 1982, I imagine, 1982, 1983. This was during the First Lebanon War, okay? Which that time they called the Lebanon War. And so this was a sort of a Rav Siach, what do you call it, like a dialogue, a panel discussion with Rav Lichtenstein and Rav Dov Lior and Rav Yaakov Chasdai and Rav Shai Yashav Cohen. Rav Shai Yashav Cohen today is the chief rabbi of Haifa. Rav Dov Lior, I think today lives in Kiryat Arba, Hebron.
No, he's a rabbi.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And Rav Yaakov Chasdai, I don't know who he is. So Rav Lichtenstein, in this very, very important and worth reading, it's like 2 or 3 pages, very, very important reading, sort of essay or statement about Musar u'Milchama, ethics and warfare, makes a very important point. And again, the Hebrew is a little small, so I'm going to read it. I'll read it from here. Tchilat hadiyun b'tziduka shel milchama hu b'musag milchemet mitzvah. Okay, so the beginning of our diyun, our evaluation, investigation, thinking about the righteousness, legitimacy of a war, is the category of milchemet mitzvah. V'chal milchemet mitzvah hi hamilchama le'ezrat Yisrael miyad tsar sheba aleihem. Okay, we saw this definition in Rambam. Right, a war of defending Israel against an enemy that's coming to attack them, that is milchemet mitzvah. Ulam, duk. However, you have to pay attention. Ezrat Yisrael. Hooray, sheyesh lisho. Ha'im ha'milchama ha'misuyemet hazo achen asuya la'azor liYisrael. V'lo kol milchama ozeret liYisrael. Okay? You have to ask. Right? The definition of the milchemet mitzvah is to come to the aid of Israel in being attacked, but you have to ask, so is this war actually going to be helpful? Not every war, Gesundheit, is helpful. And then he elaborates a little bit, there's a price to war. Reshiti, doreshet et, karbarotea, mi'itanu, kamoshe mevi, haminchat chinuch, b'mitzvah, tavkaf hey, she'ein nismach al nisim b'milchama, ulam yesh l'chshosh l'nefilatam shel, lochamei Yisrael, amnam eluhem pratim mitoch klal ha'umah, right? The Each individual who dies is a whole world to himself, and that has to be weighed when evaluating the war. And then he continues, also the price in enemy casualties has to be evaluated as well. Right? The enemy also is created in the image of God. Every time the handiwork of God is drowning in the sea, we have to be concerned. And certainly the actual numbers of casualties, of enemy casualties, has to be weighed. Is the number of enemy casualties worth the rescue of however many individuals we might say? Finally, also war has a moral cost on a society that wages war. In Deuteronomy 23, the Torah says, beware of all evil things when you go out to fight. And Ramban says, Hayashar bivnei adam b'tivo, yilabesh achzariyut v'chema kitzei machane al-ayev, v'alken hizhir bo hakatu v'chulei. Right? The nicest person will clothe himself in violence and cruelty when an army goes out to war against its enemy, and therefore the Torah gives special sanction to be wary of that at a time of war. And he continues in other ways. I think that the part that I really, most important to me though, is and maybe most troubling, is the beginning. Is this war actually going to help? Which is not it's not an ethical evaluation. It's not a halachic evaluation. That's a political evaluation. And what Lichtenstein is pointing out is that the ethics of war, the justice of the war, ultimately hinges on a political question. Will this war accomplish anything? Will it be effective? And I think that's really, really crucial, right? Because you can make whatever claims, and we see in recent, you can think of a dozen examples where each side of a war is, and both nations are claiming they're fighting in self-defense. Or within a nation, you can, there can be an argument that is this war a just war, is this not a just war? Even within, two factions within a nation arguing about a given war. And really, it's a political question, and it's maybe impossible to, there's no Archimedean point, right? Archimedes said, if I had a place to stand, I could move the earth with a what?
A fulcrum, a lever.
A lever, whatever, right? So, but there is no place to stand, right? You can't use necessarily Jewish sources as an Archimedean point to kind of separate oneself and then evaluate. I think Wolkenfeld is pointing out that these political dimensions are constantly at the forefront. Is this war going to accomplish anything? Will we be better off afterwards than we were before? Will we accomplish something that's worth the heavy moral price in our own casualties, in our enemy casualties, also created in the image of God, and in what it does to our society, the violence and et cetera, and cruelty that it seep into a society that has to fight wars. So that to me is a very troubling point, because I think that means there's no easy answer. But to me, I think it's I don't know. It seems very, very core to me. Questions, comments? Yeah, Sean.
If an enemy is coming to attack you, then obviously defending yourself is going to quote unquote help. But so is he saying that? It sounds like he's trying to make a distinction. You don't have to emphasize the word help, because the commandment for an obligatory.
So look. Let's think of the example. He's writing during the midst of the Lebanon War. So what had happened? There were incursions across the border, and there were rockets or something, and terrorist attacks, and different bases, across the border. So the Israeli army invaded, half of Lebanon, and into Beirut. So that's. So you could say, so is that meaning? Is that help? Was that? Right. In other words, there's always a choice, right? Meaning, somebody's literally, coming into your home with a knife. Okay, so stopping them is probably going to be helpful, but launching an invasion of a country in a situation where maybe you have choices. Right? I think the Lebanon War for many Israelis was understood to be the first war of choice, in the sense, right? Of course there were, or not of course, but there were, I believe. Reasons, there were, casus belli, there were grounds for war, but I think many felt at the time, or came to feel, that it didn't actually accomplish anything. And Wolkenfeld is saying here, okay, so then it's not worth the cost, the moral cost, the cost in human lives, if it doesn't actually leave us in a better off place.
But is there a category of, is every time, if someone is coming to attack, if another nation is coming to attack you, and you don't fight, and it becomes clear that they will just conquer your land, and who knows what will happen, does that mean you're obligated to always fight? Like the rebels on Masada, were they following
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Meaning, I don't think there's no obligation to commit suicide, right? And there's no. You can surrender. Surrender is certainly an okay choice, and I think the Masada story. I had a Yeshayahu Gafni is a professor of ancient Jewish history at Hebrew University. He used to teach at Harvard every 3 or 4 years. So I took a course with him, and he told a story. He was once on interviewed for a TV show about Masada, and they asked him. Tell us, Professor, of the impact of the Masada story on Jewish history. And he said, absolutely none. Because no Jew knew about Masada for 2,000 years. It was sort of archaeologists kind of discovered it in the 20th century, and it sort of became an important part of Zionist mythology and history in the 1920s, I believe. There's a chapter in Ari Shavit's book about Masada. I think as the Zionist movement in Eretz Yisrael realized that actually they were going to have to fight a war to achieve their dreams, which the early Zionists had not quite realized. Masada became important to them, and they started tiyulim and hikes and climbing. It became, but this was not a traditional Jewish story.
So even in the case when you are attacked
Look, in fact, I'll give you the counter story, which is like a foundation story of Jewish tradition, is the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai. What did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai do? The Romans, had Jerusalem besieged, and he pretended to be dead, and they carried him out of Jerusalem in a coffin, and he jumped out of the coffin. He went to the Roman general, and he bowed down to him, and called him, and offered him, right? And what did he ask for? Give me Yavne v'chachameh. So you're definitely allowed to surrender, right? You're allowed to, negotiate and whatever, and that story also has not necessarily a happy ending, because at his deathbed he's crying because he doesn't know. Maybe he should have asked for more. Did he have in his power to ask to spare Jerusalem or spare the Beit HaMikdash? Could he have asked for more? And should he have asked for more? So it's the rest of his life he was in doubt about that moment and whether he did the right thing. But that's certainly a different course. It's a more that's a course of action that's more influential for the later development of Judaism. Now, yeah.
I read an article that there was the third category of war that's permitted but not obligatory, and that would be, for instance, if a country is imposing economic hardships on you, like blockading your ports so you can't get goods, or if they're attacking your neighbors whom you are friendly with, you're allowed to go to war, but you're not required.
I've not seen that explicitly. I mean, the Milchemet Rishut we saw was a category that seems to be require Sanhedrin and Urim V'Tumim, and to go to war for a treaty. That's interesting. That's very interesting, actually. It is very interesting. A whole other category, whatever. There's other sources here which you can look at. There's further reading you can look at. We should wrap up in really maybe a minute or two, but I'll just say a whole other interesting category is Jewish evaluation of wars between non-Jews. Right? It's also an interesting category, and so there's a very extensive halachic literature about the draft and to what extent Jews are allowed to avoid the draft, and can you lotteries, and can you get your son out of the Russian army by sending somebody else's kid instead? And the Russians used to send these spies, to find out who had kids who could be drafted, and the Russians used their army as a tool of assimilation. They would take you for 20 years, and you would forget you were Jewish, and that was part of the intention. So Jewish communities used to murder these informers who would go, and then the Mosrim who would kind of tell the Russians who had a son who was military age, and that's a whole interesting halachic literature. There's you have a few cases of Jewish patriotism. Through it, you have the Islamic army that conquered Spain had Jews fighting, and defended Spain against the Christians. That Jews defended Spain with their Muslim neighbors against the Christians. There was Shmuel HaNagid, was a great leader of Spanish Jewry and was a general in the Muslim army in Granada. So that's an interesting example. And then the other cases of real Jewish patriotism you find after the French Revolution, when Napoleon convened the Sanhedrin, right, of French Jewish leaders, and he said, are the Jews a nation? Are you Jews a religion? And they said, well, we're religion, we're French, but we have a different religion. And he said, will you Jews defend France? And they all rose up and said, to the death, they all, proclaimed. So that's an example. The other great sort of example is Sam Shmuel Hirsch, who was an important German Orthodox rabbi, says that there's an obligation to defend the fatherland with one's fellow citizens, and there was a massive amount of Jewish patriotism in Germany during the First World War. That's sort of one of the earliest, most well-developed examples of Jewish patriotism is in World War I in Germany, and you see, and in other contexts, and especially in America, that's sort of developed, I think, in maybe also a nice way or interesting way in recent.
Even the famous stories that during Yom Kippur, in the First World
Yes.
War, Gentile German soldiers replaced their Jewish soldiers that they can just break for the.
Interesting. That is very interesting. The other, I was going to say, there's a story I heard. There were also Jews, of course, in World War I, fighting on both sides of the front, which is something very, there's some very poignant stories as well of people realizing, hand-to-hand combat, people were saying Shema and realizing that they're fighting that someone else was Jewish, or, it's a poignant story. think that probably hasn't happened since then, as far as I can think. I guess I just say, I think the preponderance of halachic weight is that non-Jews also can't fight wars against each other unless it's for self-defense. And maybe that's a close here. It's an interesting piece of Professor Ravitsky points out here is that in Jewish tradition, all the sort of the wars and military ethos of Tanakh gets spiritualized in later Jewish history. And so Chazal see episodes of warfare in the Bible and say, well, it's symbolic, it's really the war against the evil inclination, it's mitzvot, it's not actual war. And he says the opposite process took place in Christianity, which the Christian Bible is a pacifist book, but once the Christians had political power, they developed this just war theory, and they had to neutralize and spiritualize all of the pacifist elements in their Bible. So we sort of have this reverse trend where Jewish sources neutralize, spiritualize, turn into metaphors, and downplay episodes of warfare in our scriptures, and the Christians neutralize and downplay and turn into metaphors all of the explicit claims of pacifism in their scriptures. Okay, let's pause here because I've been talking for a long time, but I feel I really feel like I just scratched the surface. So I'm happy to continue to think about this with you, and we can talk about this together in the coming minutes and the coming months and years. Okay, thank you.